Speaker.
David Cleandon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unfortunately, Mr. Sabin, I'm going to disappoint you, as I'm sure I so often do. Mr. Speaker, we've heard a lot already about some of the difficulties and the problems with this the bill. To begin on a positive note, I'd have to say that the bill appears to be well-intentioned. It does identify a real problem, and essentially that problem is one of intimidation. People who feel intimidated by young men strutting around, or indeed not so young men, wearing gang patches, and specifically inside public buildings, government buildings, where people who might be going around their legitimate business, staff members in those places, have a right to feel protected and safe. So this bill may be well-intentioned. There is a real problem there. It is by no means a new problem. In fact, the problem is at least 40 years old, and that's worth repeating. The problem of gangs has been around for something like 40 years. Unfortunately, we see nothing in this draft legislation that will take us anywhere near solving that problem or removing that problem of intimidation. It's not so much about what a person may or may not be wearing, it's about attitude, it's about behaviour. This bill goes nowhere towards solving the deep-seated, real underlying causes of those behaviours. It is very superficial and will not work, and we see no reason to support it. The essence of the bill is found in section 6. Fairly straightforward statement. It says, and I quote, "No person may display gang insignia at any time in government premises, full stop. And anyone doing so is subject to up to a $2,000 fine." That seems like a pretty reasonable, a fairly straightforward proposition, but unfortunately it's far from it. This law, as has been pointed out by previous Labor speakers, borders on the absurd in the sense that it would become, if not unenforceable, it would put the police in a ridiculous situation of having to arrest somebody who's sitting quietly in a bus stop if they happen to be wearing a patch. There are major issues about identifying what is actually gang insignia. And while we've heard a great deal about one submission from the government benches, we haven't heard so much about the very good and comprehensive submission, for example, from Stephen Rollo, who presented us with a large number of images, of photographs, of insignia and other forms of decoration, if you like, which might appear to look like insignia, and to the layperson, to a person working in a Winds office in Masterton or a housing corporation office in Manukau, would have no idea how to distinguish between gang insignia that is barred according to the legislation and the number of gangs listed in it, and a garment, a t-shirt, a cap, a badge, a buckle, which one can buy perfectly legally and wear. It is incredibly difficult for people, for non-experts, if you like, for lay people, including government employees, to identify, well, what is gang insignia and what is not. The likelihood of provoking responses from people, undesirable responses, if you challenge them for the garments they're wearing, if they are legally wearing those garments, is not worth the candle. There is simply not enough benefit in this bill. There is not sufficient in this bill. I invite Mr Sabin to look at Stephen Rollo's submission and look at the reality of the problem. The police officer who was there said the police have no problem identifying gang insignia. It is not an issue for the police. It is about public servants, members of the public, who will have no idea what is gang insignia and what is not. The notion of government premises. Again, this has been traversed already. I won't go dwell on it, but the absurdity of a person breaking the law by standing on a footpath, under a veranda, or sitting in a bus shelter, quite innocently, wearing a patch, they can be subject to arrest, their vehicles can be searched and so on. This is bad law. It makes no sense to write law that puts police in ridiculous situations where they are obliged to prosecute behaviour that's not intended to be covered in the legislation. The list of unintended consequences of this bill could go on at some length. So I've made the point that the problem of gangs has been with us for some time. and anybody with a genuine interest in gangs in New Zealand and an interest in solving the problem or the suite of problems around them, I recommend to have a read of this book, recently published by Dr. Jared Gilbert and called Patch, The History of Gangs in New Zealand. It was the basis of a PhD thesis and now converted into a very readable book, and I commend it to anybody who's genuinely interested in the problem of gangs and the solutions to gangs. It is an excellent social history, a political history. It outlines from a person who's had very close relationships with gangs the nature of the problem. There's a quotation in the book that I'd like to read from a former member of this House, in fact, who, in the context of talking about gang and gang violence, he said this, I quote, "The problem will not be solved by throwing a law at it." And I think that's something we should keep in our minds in our day-to-day work as MP. Problems cannot necessarily be solved by throwing a law at it. That former MP and former minister went on to say that alienation and lack of job opportunities were two key drivers of this gang behaviour. I suspect the members of the government will be wondering who this MP was, assuming he's some left-leaning close. Not quite. A left-leaning left Liberal. In fact, it was Jim Macleay in 1979 as Minister of Justice who said, "The problem of gangs will not be solved by throwing a law at it." This, unfortunately, is an attempt we're seeing with this legislation to throw a law at a problem. The law will simply bounce off. We can put our hands up to certain behaviours and say thou shalt not. If we don't remove the the underlying causes of that behaviour, we're simply dealing with symptoms, not causes, and unfortunately that's what this bill does. I'd like to quote another former politician, also referenced in this bill, who said that Parliament must examine closely the social, economic and community climate that breeds and fosters the kind of alienation and brutal desperation that we saw last weekend. That was in 1979, it was Bill Rowling, talking about an incident in Moirua, an incredibly violent incident where a number of police officers and firefighters were seriously hurt as a result of gang violence. 1979, by gang members, already the problem then was 10 years old. Policemen were carried away, seriously hurt. We haven't resolved that problem. This legislation may be a worthy attempt, but it does not get to the core of the issue. It makes no pretense of dealing with the underlying causes of gang violence and gang behaviours which we want to drive out. Robert Muldoon made some commentary in his day about gangs and sought to resolve it by creating work opportunities. The detached youth workers, essentially, they were mostly former gang and indeed existing gang members who brought groups of gang members together, found work contracts for them, kept them busy, gave them a source of income that didn't rely on drugs, intimidation, other forms of offending. It was a rather enlightened approach, I have to say, and that's the sort of responses we need. We need to drill down to the real causes of offending. We need to look at what is actually going on here. This bill creates so many perverse incentives. I believe that having a particular gang name listed in the legislation and the regulations will become something of a moniker. It'll be something gang members are proud of. They will actually behave in ways that will ensure that their gang insignia gets named in the legislation. It will be a point of pride with them, which is an incredibly perverse incentive to put into law. So I'd like to give the last word in this speech, at least, to Jared Gilbert, the author of this very good book. He says, as long as New Zealand has communities faced with poor education, overcrowded housing, unemployment, family abuse, poverty, the country will always have gangs. Steam is the inevitable result of water being boiled, and gangs are the clear result of certain social conditions. So this legislation perhaps takes us one step forward, but would in fact put us 2 steps back. It is not readily enforceable legislation. It does not address core issues. It does not address causes of behaviour. It does not address causes of offending. It has been described as window dressing, and sadly, that is, we can't see anything in it beyond that and will not be supporting the bill.
Point of order. Tim McIndoe.
Following discussion in the Business Committee, I seek leave for the House to suspend for the dinner break at the conclusion of Dr Jackie Blue's valedictory speech this evening.
Leave is sought for that purpose. Is there anyone opposed to that course of action? There appears not. Leave is granted. Next call.
Speaker.
Mark Mitchell.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to stand and